Now we are going to move on to making the cover of our handmade sketchbook. So you should have your fat quarter of fabric, and I've got that one little section cut out that we used to make the wings. I have just really lightly ironed it just to help it lay a little bit flatter, but you don't have to do that. We're going to flip it over to where the right side of the fabric is face down and we're seeing the back edge. And then you're going to need a couple of extra things today. You're going to need the 2 pieces of mat board that I've provided you. They're light on one side and dark on another, and then the little piece that's going to be the spine of our book. And to show you how this is going to be laid out, I am going to spread out my fabric right there. And if you have a light colored fabric like I do, mine is just yellow and white, I'm going to want to put the white side of my mat board is what's going to get glued down. But if you have a dark fabric, you'll want to glue the dark side down. And the reason for that, just so you can kind of see when I show you the front of the fabric, if I overlay that and glue it down on white board, the colors are much more pure and I can slightly see through it so the white looks better on top of white. But if you have a dark fabric, notice how much darker this board, the dark side looks. So again, if you have a dark colored fabric, you're going to be gluing the dark side down to your fabric. But if you have a light fabric like I do, you're going to be gluing the white side down. So pay very close attention to that whenever you get ready to start. But to show you the spacing, I'm just going to start near a corner, and I'm leaving about a knuckles space between the edge and the bottom. So there to there. That's about an inch. So just, it doesn't have to be too precise, but I just guesstimate with about the length of 1 knuckle. And then the spine will get laid down next to that. But we are not going to lay the spine down touching. We're going to split those 2 pieces apart and give it about an 1/8 or a 1/16 of an inch. A tiny, tiny little space between them. And to guesstimate and see how much that spacing should be, I want you to visualize the thickness of that mat board. And how thick that mat board is how far apart I want you to spread them. So that distance looks about right. If you end up gluing it down where that distance is too big, like that is too big there, the cover of your book is going to be a little bit looser and maybe not as tightly structured as it should be. And then the next one, we'll do the same thing, leaving that same amount of space. It will get laid down there. And that's how we're going to lay out to glue. And now notice I have a lot of extra fabric up here at the top. I've got some extra fabric over here on the other side. We're going to trim that down later, but that way you can kind of see how that's all spaced out. Now I'm going to slide that up to the top of my workspace and get a scrap piece of paper. And I'm going to grab the first board and flip it where I'm gluing on the light side. The other thing that you're going to need today is your Eileen's tacky glue. Now I've been using this glue for years and it is the best brand that I have found that holds your fabric really securely and doesn't cause bubbles or parts to not be glued down really well to your board. So this is the best product that I've been able to find for that. And then you'll also need an inexpensive paintbrush and a cup of water and a paper towel. When you open your tacky glue for the very first time, you will notice that this top portion probably needs to be cut off with a pair of scissors. Now this glue is extremely thick and it's extremely tacky, so we're going to be spreading it out with a paintbrush, but it is really difficult to do. So you have to work very quickly so it doesn't dry, and you have to really put some muscle into it to get it spread out nice and thin. But we want a very smooth, thin, even coat. If you don't get glue everywhere on this board, what ends up happening is the fabric doesn't adhere to the area that doesn't have glue, and then your fabric ends up with sort of these unglued bubbles, these sort of sections that move, and we want them to be really, really firm. Another thing that you want to make sure is that you don't have the glue on there too thickly, because if the glue is too thick, it's going to squish through your fabric and come through on the front part of your fabric, and we don't want that either. So this part's really important. You work smoothly, work efficiently, but work very carefully at the same time. So I'm going to get all that glue worked down to the bottom of the bottle, and I'm going to start like that. And now, working pretty quickly, I'm going to grab that paintbrush and start spreading that glue out. I'm going to switch to a bigger brush just to make this a little bit more efficient. And you'll notice you really have to pull that glue to get it everywhere. And working with this brush wet kind of helps thin that glue down just a little bit and spreads it out more evenly. And I want to make sure that it gets right up to the edges. And I just added a little bit of water to my bristles again just to help thin that glue out just a smidge more. And I'm looking at it at an angle to see where the light is glaring off of it to make sure I don't have any patches that are missing glue. And this really does, this like wears out my arms to get this glue spread out enough. You have to be pretty aggressive with this part of the project. And then very, very quickly, I'm going to grab my fabric, bring it back down, line it back up where I had it originally, and press everything down. So again, I've got about a knuckles width at the bottom and a knuckles width on the side. And then I'm gonna flip it over to the front and smooth where I can see the pretty side of my fabric face up. And then that should be secured pretty well. Now I'm gonna move on to the spine and do the same thing with it. This is really challenging to work as fast as you need to go to get that glue spread out. And the bottle that I have too is an older bottle. I've had it for a while, so that glue thickens with age. So if you have a brand new bottle, it may be a little bit easier to work with than this particular one. So for the spine, I'm just gonna put one line of glue and then start spreading it out. This piece is smaller, so it's a little bit easier to get it spread out without it drying too quickly on you. And you'll end up with this glue kind of all over your fingernails, but don't worry about it. It will come off. So again, just really working that glue back and forth to make sure it's a thin coat, spread out nice and evenly. And I think that looks good. So now I'm going to slide my fabric back down and line it up very carefully. Again, just a 1/16 of an inch or an 1/8 of an inch, just very, very small, making sure it's lined up across the bottom and the top. Press it down really firmly. Flip it over and press it from the front. That looks pretty good. And now I'm going to do my last piece. Now if that piece of paper gets really gluey and gunky, just throw that away, grab a new fresh one. That looks pretty good. When I'm touching the front of this all feels pretty secured down into the glue. I don't feel like I've got any bubbles. If you realize that as soon as you've done it before that glue dries, if you realize part of it is not quite glued down good, say for example, a lot of times the corners tends to be a little area that could use a little bit of a touch up, you can certainly add an extra tiny little dot. Thin it down with your brush and just make sure. You just want to do that in really tiny amounts because you don't want big thick dabs of glue. You want to make sure you thin it down with your paintbrush. And then you shouldn't feel a whole lot of moisture coming through on the front if you've gotten just the right amount of glue. It feels cool to the touch but not wet. So now I'm going to flip this back over. And the spacing that I've left here, the reason why we've done that is because we need for our book to be able to close to a 90-degree angle to form that pretty spine where it meets up with the edges of the front and back cover. Now, what we're going to do is cut off the extra fabric, and we're going to, again, sort of taking that knuckle width that we have on the two sides, we're going to guesstimate and do about that same amount, that knuckle width, on the other two sides. And so now we have the front finished, and now we're ready to start gluing the fabric. We're going to be folding it over and making a really pretty edge for the inside of our book. Now to do that, once we fold our edges over, I want you to see what happens. If I fold this edge over and then I fold this edge over and start to glue them down, notice on those corners we're going to end up with this extra fabric that we need to figure out what to do with. And I have a really great trick that solves that problem and gets rid of that excess. You can take a ruler, but from each corner I'm going to come out again just a hair, about a 1/16 of an inch, and at a 45-degree angle that little corner right there is what I'm going to trim off. And now notice, it's just a smidge bit away from the edge. It is not directly at the corner. If you put it right up against that corner, you end up with like a little bit of a gap. So notice it's out just the tiniest amount from there. And then very carefully, I'm gonna snip that off right along that line. So notice we have a tiny bit extra, not a lot, but a little bit. And now when I go through to fold those pieces up and over, notice that those corners now match and we don't have that extra fabric there. So if you fold this up and over and you see that you still have maybe too much fabric, you can very carefully trim off just a little smidge more. And then we're gonna do that on each corner. So 45-degree angle from the corner, out just a fraction, maybe a 1/16 of an inch. What happens is that little tiny gap that we leave right there at that corner is just enough for the fabric to wrap over the thickness of the board, of the mat board. And then once you pull everything really tight, everything should match up and give you a perfect seam right there on the edge. Now that takes time, so be really patient and make sure you cut that part very carefully. Okay, so now my corners should all match up and give me a really pretty little edge. And now we're ready to glue. So I always like to glue the two short sides first and then glue the two long sides. And I've got a very specific way that I want you to go about this. So the first thing I'm gonna do is just visualize when I flip this short side back about how much space it takes up on the mat board. So I'm gonna grab my tacky glue again. And I'm gonna put a little bit of glue out in that space. And with my damp brush, I'm gonna thin that glue out. And you can actually see what the glue looks like better on this dark side of the mat board. And having that damp brush does help thin that glue down just a little bit. Again, everything is pretty smooth. You can also just really gently rub your brush right along the edge, just to make sure that edge gets glued too. And then, while this is very wet and working pretty quickly, I'm gonna start in the middle, and I'm gonna pull this fabric back nice and tight, and push straight back into the middle of the book. Now, once I've got the middle done, I'm then gonna move out, and instead of pushing straight back, I'm now pushing slightly out into the sides. And doing this way is gonna ensure that this edge seam is pulled really, really tight, and then my corners will match up nicely. So start in the middle, then move to the outside edges, and I'm just rubbing my fingers and pushing and getting all that sealed down, and then I'll do the same thing on the other side. pushing, stretching that fabric so I get a nice tight fit. And I'm pushing slightly out towards the corners. Like that. And now this looks and feels really nice. I've got a nice pretty edge here. You can see how it just curls over from the front. And now I'm going to rotate and do the same thing on the other short side. Okay, so that short side is finished, and now we're going to do the long sides. For the long sides, I do try to make sure that I don't get glue on this fabric that's already glued down. Again, really working that glue, making sure that there's no thick globs of it anywhere. And same technique, I'm going to start in the middle with the spine this time and push straight back. And then I'm going to move out to my corners, pushing outward and back at the same time, out in that direction. Working out any wrinkles. And if I do that, hopefully when we get over here to the corner, this fabric is going to meet up and I won't see any of the mat board through it. Now if you end up with your fabric overlapping a little bit, that's okay, that's not the end of the world. You can take a very tiny little brush and wiggle just a little bit of glue in there. And just get all that laid down. I would rather the fabric overlay just a tiny bit rather than leaving a gap and showing the mat board through it. So now I have a little bit of extra fabric there. add just enough glue to make sure that's tacked down. Now, once you get this finished, that's what your cover is going to look like. So it should look pretty good. Hopefully you don't have thick sections of glue that are coming through. One thing I always tell my students, because inevitably that happens to some people and that's not the end of the world, but if that happens to you, we are going to be putting a cover design on the front cover. And as long as your book doesn't matter with the pattern, let's say, for example, I end up with a splotch of glue that's too thick right here. I can make that my front cover, and then that way the back cover would still be pretty, where we're not going to add a design later.